They thought the war was over. In the autumn of 1943, as golden leaves drifted through the cobblestone streets of southern Italy, something had changed in the air. The whispers carried a different weight now. Hope, fragile and trembling, but hope nonetheless. Did you know that over 64,000 Italian civilians died under Allied bombs during their own liberation? Share in the comments which country you're watching from, because this story belongs to all of us. For 3 long years, the people of Naples, Cassino, and Foggia had lived under the shadow of war. German boots had echoed through their piazzas. Blackout curtains had turned their windows into empty eyes. Children had learned to sleep through the thunder of distant artillery, their small hands clutching rosaries worn smooth by their mother's prayers. But now the leaflets were falling from the sky like autumn snow. Maria Benedetti, a baker's wife from the Quartiere Spagnoli of Naples, found one clinging to her windowsill that October morning. The paper was crisp, clean, so different from the ration cards and propaganda posters that had dominated their lives. In careful Italian, it promised bread, democracy, freedom from fear. "Gli aliati stanno arrivando," she whispered to her neighbor. "Signora Rossi, the Allies are coming." The word spread through the narrow alleys like wildfire. Mothers who had forgotten how to smile began kneading flour with trembling hands. Children, pale from months of hiding in cellars, crept onto balconies to peer at the horizon. Even the church bells, silent for so long, began to ring tentative notes of celebration. Father Giuseppe, the parish priest of Santa Lucia, watched his congregation grow day by day. People who had lost faith were returning, lighting candles with shaking fingers. "Grazie, Madonna," they whispered. "La guerra è finita." The war is over, but wars do not end with whispers. The first signs should have warned them. The German soldiers, once arrogant in their black uniforms, now moved with urgency. Trucks loaded with ammunition rumbled north through the night. Wehrmacht officers studied maps with grim faces, their fingers tracing defensive lines that cut through the heart of Italy like surgical scars. Still, the people celebrated. How could they not? In the markets of Naples, vendors began selling fruits they had hidden for months. Wine appeared on tables where only water had been poured. Young couples, who had postponed their weddings for years, began whispering about ceremonies in the spring. "The Americans will come with chocolate," the children sang, remembering stories their grandparents told of the Great War. "And the British will bring tea and kindness." Liberation was coming. They could taste it in the salt air that drifted up from the Bay of Naples. They could hear it in the distant rumble that grew stronger each night. Not the harsh mechanical roar of German panzers, but something else. Something that sounded almost like thunder. But thunder does not fly in formation. On the evening of November 15th, 1943, as families gathered around their radios to hear the BBC's Italian service, the distant rumble became impossible to ignore. It echoed off the volcanic slopes of Vesuvius, bounced between the ancient buildings of the city center, and settled in the pit of every stomach like a stone. The children pressed their faces to windows, pointing at the sky. "Look, Mama, the airplanes." At first, they were just specks, silver dots against the darkening clouds, moving in perfect V formations like migrating birds. The sight was almost beautiful, majestic in its precision. Some people even waved from their balconies, believing these were the harbingers of their salvation. Maria Benedetti set down her bowl of pasta and stepped onto her terrace. The engines grew louder, a deep thrum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. She counted them, 20, 30, 40, more than she could number. The sky was darkening with wings. "Why are there so many?" her 8-year-old son Antonio asked, tugging at her apron. She had no answer. In the stories, liberation came with soldiers marching through the streets, with flags and songs of victory. Not with this. Not with a sky so thick with aircraft that the stars disappeared. The air raid sirens began to wail. The sound cut through the evening like a blade, that bone-deep moan that every Italian had learned to fear. But this time, it felt different, urgent, desperate. as if the sirens themselves were screaming a warning that came too late. People froze in their doorways, confusion written across their faces. These were supposed to be their liberators. The bombs were supposed to fall on German positions, on military targets, on the enemies of freedom. Not on them. Never on them. Father Giuseppe ran from house to house, his black robes billowing behind him. To the churches, he shouted. The basilicas have thick walls. Pray to Sant'Antonio. He will protect us. But as the first wave of bombers passed overhead, their engines drowning out even the screams of children, a terrible realization began to dawn. The aircraft were not heading north toward the German lines. They were not seeking out barracks or supply depots or ammunition factories. They were heading directly toward the heart of Naples. The first flares burst open like deadly flowers, bathing the ancient city in harsh white light. Every dome, every bell tower, every crowded tenement building stood exposed, naked under the artificial daylight. The Castel dell'Ovo, the royal palace, the narrow warren of streets where 300,000 people lived and breathed and dreamed. All of it illuminated like a stage set for tragedy. Maria pulled her son close to her chest, feeling his small heart hammering against her ribs. Around them, neighbors were running in every direction. Toward the metro stations, toward the churches, toward basements that might become tombs. The lucky ones had family in the countryside. The rest had nowhere to go but down. Mama, Antonio whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of engines. Why are the angels so loud? She looked up at the bombers passing overhead, their silver bellies gleaming in the flare light, and for a moment, she almost understood his confusion. They did look like mechanical angels, terrible and beautiful, carrying death in their wings. The thunder was no longer distant. It was here, directly above them. And it was not the sound of liberation, it was the sound of judgment, as the last of the flares drifted down like falling stars, casting dancing shadows across the terrified faces below. Maria Benedetti held her son tighter and whispered the only prayer that seemed to matter. Santa Maria, Madre de Dio. They said they came to save us, but the sky had already begun to open, and what fell was not salvation. The liberation of Italy was supposed to be different. When Marshal Pietro Badoglio signed the armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, church bells rang across the peninsula. King Victor Emmanuel III had fled Rome. Mussolini had fallen. For one brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Italy might escape the final act of Europe's tragedy. But wars have their own momentum, and the German war machine was not ready to surrender the boot of Italy without a fight. Within hours of the armistice, Wehrmacht forces activated Fall Axe, Case Axis, a brutal plan to disarm Italian forces and transform the peninsula into Fortress Europe's southern wall. German divisions poured down from the Alps like a steel avalanche. Rome fell under occupation. The Italian people, who had believed themselves free, discovered they had simply traded one master for another, and caught between the grinding millstones of two armies. They began to die. The Allied strategy was as simple as it was merciless. Smash German resistance from the air, then advance on the ground. Operation Husky had proven that Italy's ancient cities could be bombed into submission. Sicily had fallen in 38 days. Now, with the Italian government in Allied hands and German forces retreating north, it seemed logical to apply the same devastating formula to the mainland. What the planners in London and Washington did not calculate was the cost in Italian blood. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, faced an impossible equation. Every day, the German army remained in Italy meant more dead American and British soldiers. Every day, they delayed the invasion of France, brought Stalin's Red Army closer to Berlin. The pressure was enormous, the timeline unforgiving. We must break German resistance quickly and decisively, Eisenhower wrote to the combined chiefs of staff in October 1943. Strategic bombing will pave the way for our ground advance. Strategic bombing. The phrase sounds clinical, almost surgical. But for the people huddled in the basements of Naples, Rome, and Foggia, strategy had a very different face. The target list read like a catalog of Italian civilization, railway stations and bridges, certainly, but also ports where fishermen brought their catch, industrial districts where workers lived in crowded tenements, airfields surrounded by villages whose only crime was proximity to military necessity. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, understood the mathematics of modern warfare. "We cannot afford to be squeamish about civilian casualties," he noted in his diary. "The German army must be cut off from supply, regardless of cost." Regardless of cost. The phrase would echo through the ruins of Italy for generations. The bombing campaign began in earnest in October 1943. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, Wellington bombers carved contrails across Italian skies. Their targets were military, the briefings always emphasized. Railway yards, ammunition depots, communication centers. But bombs, once dropped, do not read military manuals. In Naples, the rail yards stood at the heart of the city, surrounded by centuries-old neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. Destroy the trains, the planners reasoned, and you cut German supply lines. The fact that 30,000 civilians lived within a quarter mile of the tracks was noted in the files, and forgotten in the execution. Captain James Morrison, a bombardier with the 5th Air Force, remembered those missions decades later with haunting clarity. "We flew at 20,000 feet. He told an interviewer in 1993, "From that height, you couldn't see faces. You couldn't see children playing in the streets. You just saw targets on a map." From 20,000 feet, Naples looked like a collection of geometric shapes. The bomber crews, young men from Kansas and Yorkshire and Ontario, could not see Maria Benedetti clutching her son. They could not hear the church bells or smell the bread baking in ancient ovens. They saw rail lines and port facilities and industrial complexes that needed to be eliminated. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Every ton of bombs dropped on Italian infrastructure was a ton that would not need to be dropped on German positions later. Every Italian railway bridge destroyed was a bridge that could not supply German defenders. Every Italian port facility eliminated was a port that could not resupply German forces. But the people below were not mathematical abstractions. Foggia, in the heel of Italy, became a symbol of this strategic logic. The city housed the largest complex of airfields in southern Europe, 15 separate bases that the German Luftwaffe used to strike Allied shipping in the Mediterranean. Capturing those airfields intact would give the Allies a platform to bomb the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, to strike targets in the Balkans, to bring the war directly to Hitler's doorstep. The strategic importance was undeniable. So was the human cost. The bombing of Foggia began on May 19, 1943, and continued intermittently for months. Each raid targeted the airfields, but each raid also killed civilians who lived and worked nearby. Families who had farmed the Apulian plains for centuries found themselves trapped between armies that viewed their homeland as a battlefield. Giuseppe Rinaldi, a farmer whose family had worked the same fields since before the Risorgimento, watched the bombers pass overhead day after day. They came like clockwork, he remembered. Every Tuesday and Friday, the sky would fill with silver wings. We learned to count them, to time their arrival. Our children stopped playing outside on bombing days. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The Allies were destroying Italy in order to save it from German occupation. They were liberating Italian cities by reducing them to rubble. They were freeing the Italian people by forcing them to live in terror of the very skies that should have brought salvation. And still the bombs fell. Rome, the eternal city, declared an open city by both sides, suffered its own violation on July 19, 1943. The target was the Littorio railway station, a legitimate military objective. But when the smoke cleared, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. The Basilica of San Lorenzo, built in the 4th century, suffered devastating damage. Hundreds of civilians died in a raid that lasted less than an hour. Pope Pius XII, the controversial pontiff who had maintained papal neutrality throughout the war, walked through the rubble of San Lorenzo that evening. Witnesses reported seeing tears on his cheeks as he blessed the bodies being pulled from the wreckage. Even he, the vicar of Christ, could not explain why liberation required such suffering. The official reports were clinical in their precision. Mission accomplished. Primary targets destroyed. Minimal opposition encountered. The bomber crews returned to their bases in North Africa and Sicily, where they were debriefed, fed hot meals, and prepared for the next day's operations. But 20,000 feet below, in the ancient streets of Italy, the mathematics of liberation were being calculated in different units. Not in tons of bombs dropped or rail lines severed, but in mothers searching through rubble for their children, in fathers digging graves with their bare hands, in priests offering last rites to entire families buried beneath the stones of their own homes. The German army, which the bombing was meant to cripple, adapted with typical efficiency. They moved their supplies at night, used mountain roads instead of railways, and established new bases in areas the Allies had already bombed. Their war machine, fed by the industrial might of the Reich, continued to function. But for the Italian people, caught between liberation and destruction, adaptation was not so simple. You cannot adapt to the loss of your child. You cannot adjust to the erasure of your neighborhood. You cannot accommodate yourself to the burning of everything you have ever known. And so they endured, these forgotten victims of liberation, while the skies above them darkened with the promise of freedom. That fell like fire. The thunder was getting closer. November 15th, 1943, 9:17 p.m. The sirens had been wailing for 7 minutes when the first bombs fell on Naples. Maria Benedetti was halfway down the stairs of her tenement building, her son Antonio clinging to her hand, when the world exploded above them. The building shuddered like a living thing in pain, plaster raining down from the ceiling like snow. In the darkness of the stairwell, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle, 37 people pressed against each other, whispering prayers in dialects older than the Italian state itself. Madonna mia, proteggici. Holy Mother, protect us. But protection was not coming from heaven that night. The first wave of bombers, 18 B-24 Liberators from the 376th Bombardment Group, had received clear orders. Destroy the port facilities and railway yards of Naples to prevent German resupply. Clean military targets. Precision bombing. Minimal civilian casualties. From 4 miles above the city, Naples looked exactly like the reconnaissance photographs. The harbor spread out like a child's toy model, the rail lines threading between buildings like silver ribbons. The bombardiers adjusted their Norden bomb sights, calculating wind speed and altitude, preparing to deliver their payload with surgical precision. But war is never surgical. The first stick of 500-pound bombs fell short of the railway yards by 300 meters. Instead of striking the marshalling area where German supply trains waited in the darkness, they fell into the heart of the Quartiere Spagnoli, the Spanish quarter, where Maria Benedetti had baked bread that morning, where children had played soccer in the narrow alleys, where 3,000 people lived in buildings constructed when Naples was still ruled by kings. The explosion lifted an entire 4-story building into the air for a single impossible moment. Then physics reasserted itself, and 12 families, 41 people, disappeared beneath tons of collapsing masonry and twisted metal. Signora Rossi, Maria's neighbor, was caught in the open courtyard when the building came down. The last thing she saw was her own laundry, hanging on the line between balconies, fluttering in the blast wave like white flags of surrender. In the stairwell, Maria felt the shock wave pass through her body like a physical blow. Antonio screamed, not in fear, but in pain, as the air pressure burst his eardrums. Around them, other children were crying, their voices thin and desperate in the choking dust. "What's happening, Mama?" he whispered, blood trickling from his ears. She had no answer. In her worst nightmares, she had imagined German bombs falling on their neighborhood. She had prepared for that war, the one where enemies wore uniforms and spoke foreign languages. But this was supposed to be salvation. The second wave arrived 6 minutes later, Master Sergeant Robert Chun, bombardier aboard the Memphis Belle II, watched his bombs fall away into the darkness below. He had flown 14 missions over Germany, had seen Hamburg burn and Dresden disappear beneath clouds of smoke. But this felt different. These were supposed to be the people they were saving. "Target acquired," he reported over the intercom. "Bombs away." Asterisk. His payload, 8,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary devices, was aimed at the Stazione Centrale, Naples' main railway terminal. The target was legitimate, militarily necessary. German supply trains used those tracks every night, but 8,000 pounds of bombs, dropped from 4 miles up in the darkness. Do not ask questions about the 3-story apartment building that stood 50 meters from the platform. They do not pause to consider the 26 families sleeping inside, or the small church next door where Father Giuseppe was hearing confessions, or the elementary school across the street where tomorrow's lessons would never be taught. The incendiary bombs hit first, turning night into artificial day. White phosphorus scattered like burning rain, setting fire to everything it touched. Wooden shutters, laundry hanging from windows, the hair of people running, screaming through the streets. The high explosives followed, punching through roofs and floors and lives with mechanical precision. Father Giuseppe was in the confessional booth, listening to old Signor Delacris whisper about the sin of stealing bread for his grandchildren. When the church of San Gennaro exploded around them, the medieval walls, built to last 1,000 years, held for almost 3 seconds against the modern fury of Allied liberation. Then the roof collapsed, and both men disappeared beneath stones that had once supported the prayers of saints. In the basement of the tenement building, Maria and the others felt each explosion like a punch to the chest. The building above them was dying, slowly and loudly. Water pipes burst, flooding the lower floors. Electrical cables sparked and went dark. The smell of smoke began to filter down through the stairwell, carrying with it something else, something sweet and terrible that Maria recognized but refused to name. Antonio had stopped crying. His small body was pressed against hers, trembling like a frightened bird. "Mama," he whispered, "are we going to die?" Around them, other children were asking the same question in voices that should have been talking about toys and games and Christmas wishes. Instead, they were learning the vocabulary of terror, fire, smoke, burial, prayer. The bombing continued for 47 minutes. Each wave of aircraft brought its own mathematical precision and human chaos. The third wave targeted the harbor, but their bombs fell among the fishing boats where old men had spent their lives hauling nets from the Bay of Naples. The fourth wave aimed for the oil storage facilities, but struck the hospital of Santa Maria degli Incurabili, where Dr. Salvatore Rossini was performing emergency surgery on a 7-year-old girl injured in the first attack. By the time the all-clear sounded, 12 city blocks had ceased to exist. The silence that followed was almost worse than the bombing itself. No sirens now, no aircraft engines, no explosions, just the crackling of fires and the sound of people calling names that would never answer. "Giuseppe, Giuseppe." An old woman's voice echoed through the rubble where her grandson's house had stood. "Anna, where are you, Anna?" A man's voice, desperate and cracking, searching for his wife among the ruins of their neighborhood pharmacy. "Help! Someone help us." Children's voices, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere beneath tons of collapsed stone. Maria emerged from the basement to find that her world had ended. The street where she had lived for 32 years was gone, not damaged, not wounded, but simply erased, as if a giant hand had swept away everything she had ever known. Where Signora Rossi's building had stood, there was now only a crater filled with burning debris. Where the corner cafe had served espresso that morning, twisted metal reached toward the sky like accusing fingers. Antonio clung to her dress, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. At 8 years old, he could not process the transformation of his universe into something from Dante's nightmares. The bakery where his mother worked, gone. The school where he studied arithmetic, collapsed. The church where he made his first communion, burning. Other survivors wandered through the destruction like sleepwalkers. their faces blank with shock. Some carried suitcases, though their homes no longer existed to leave. Others clutched photographs, the only proof that their families had ever lived. A few simply stood in the middle of the rubble, turning in slow circles, trying to understand what had happened to reality. Carmela Esposito, a widow with 4 children, knelt beside what had been her apartment building, digging through broken stones with her bare hands. Her fingernails were torn and bleeding, but she kept digging, whispering her children's names like a prayer. They were in the basement, she told anyone who would listen. All 4 of them. They were safe in the basement. But the basement had become a tomb. Around midnight, Allied military police arrived to secure the area. Young American soldiers, barely older than the children buried in the rubble, walked through the devastation with expressions of horror and confusion. This was not what they had expected liberation to look like. Lieutenant James O'Brien, a 22-year-old from Boston, had volunteered for this mission, believing he was helping to free the Italian people from fascist oppression. Instead, he found himself stepping over the bodies of children whose only crime had been living too close to a railway station. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to his sergeant. "What happened here?" "Liberation," Sergeant Murphy replied, his voice flat and bitter. "This is what liberation looks like." The survivors looked at these young soldiers with eyes that held no gratitude, no relief, no joy. Only questions that could never be answered. If these were their liberators, why did the city burn? If these were their saviors, why were their children dead? If this was freedom, why did it feel like punishment? As dawn approached, the true scale of the catastrophe became clear. Over 800 civilians had died in the bombing, more than in any single German air raid on Naples during the entire war. Thousands more were wounded, homeless, orphaned. Entire families had been erased from existence, their names now written only in smoke rising from the ruins. Maria walked through the burning streets, carrying Antonio in her arms, searching for somewhere to go. Behind them, their home smoldered. Ahead of them, the city burned. Around them, the dead lay beneath stones that had once sheltered the living. The leaflets had promised bread and democracy and freedom from fear. Instead, the liberators had delivered fire from heaven and the ashes of everything the people of Naples had ever loved as the sun rose over the ruined city, casting long shadows through the smoke. One truth became inescapably clear. Liberation had come to Italy, and it was terrible to behold. Dawn came like an accusation over Naples. The sun, indifferent to human suffering, painted the smoke-filled sky in shades of rose and gold, colors that should have spoken of hope but instead illuminated a landscape from the depths of hell. Where the Quartiere Spagnoli had bustled with life just 12 hours before, only silence reigned now, broken by the occasional crash of weakened walls, finally surrendering to gravity. Maria Benedetti stood in what had been Via dei Tribunali. Her son Antonio still clutched against her chest. The ancient street, carved by Roman hands 2,000 years ago, had become a river of rubble and ash. Every landmark of her life had been erased with mathematical precision. The silence was wrong. Naples had never been quiet, not in living memory. There should have been vendors calling their wares, children laughing on their way to school, the gossip of women hanging laundry from wrought iron balconies. Instead, there was only the whisper of ash settling and the distant sound of weeping. "Mama," Antonio whispered, his voice hoarse from smoke and terror. "Where is everyone?" She looked around at the wasteland that had been her neighborhood and realized she didn't know. Where were the Rossinis who had lived above the grocer? Where were the 5 children from the 3rd floor who had played soccer with Antonio just yesterday? Where was Father Giuseppe, who had blessed every baby born in this district for 30 years? Some were dead, she knew. The math was simple and terrible. No one could have survived in the buildings that had taken direct hits. But others had simply vanished, scattered to the winds like ash, seeking shelter with relatives in distant villages or crowded into refugee camps that were already overflowing. The living searched for the dead with desperate determination. Salvatore Torino, A barber whose shop had stood on this corner for 40 years knelt beside a pile of bricks that had once been his home. His wife Concetta and their 3 daughters had been inside when the bombs fell. For 6 hours, he had been digging with his hands, moving stone after stone, whispering their names. Concetta, Rosa, Lucia, Francesca. Other survivors worked beside him, strangers now united in grief, forming chains to pass debris, sharing tools that had somehow survived the devastation. They worked without speaking, understanding that words were inadequate for this magnitude of loss. A British army truck rumbled through the ruins, its wheels crunching over broken glass and shattered lives. Young soldiers in clean uniforms distributed relief supplies, tins of food, blankets, medical supplies. Their faces bore expressions of shock and confusion, as if they couldn't understand why the people they had come to liberate looked at them with such hollow, accusing eyes. Food. Hot soup, called Corporal Davies, a Welsh boy who had joined the army to fight fascists and instead found himself ladling broth for orphan children. Medical aid. We have doctors, but some wounds cannot be treated with bandages. Senora Esperanza, who had run a small tavern near the port, stood in the rubble of her life's work and stared at the soldiers with eyes like broken glass. Her husband had died fighting Mussolini's black shirts in 1922. Her eldest son had been killed by German soldiers during the occupation. Now her youngest boy, Matteo, lay buried beneath stones dropped by the very people who claimed to be her saviors. Liberation, she spat when a young American medic approached to treat the cuts on her hands. This is your liberation? The medic, Private Johnson from a farm in Nebraska, had no answer. He had joined the army believing he was fighting for freedom and democracy. He had imagined grateful crowds throwing flowers at victorious soldiers. He had never imagined this. Mothers digging graves with their fingernails, children orphaned by their own salvation doubt by noon. The full scope of the tragedy had become undeniable. 814 civilians confirmed dead, over 2,000 wounded, 3,000 rendered homeless. Entire families erased from existence, not just killed, but obliterated so completely that there was no trace they had ever lived. The railway station, the military target that had justified this destruction, remained largely intact. German supply trains continued to run, now carrying wounded Wehrmacht soldiers alongside ammunition and supplies. The strategic objective had failed, but the human cost had been paid in full. Aid stations were established in the few buildings still standing. The Church of Santa Chiara, damaged but not destroyed, became a makeshift hospital where Dr. Elena Martinelli worked 18-hour shifts, treating injuries she had never encountered in medical school. Burns from white phosphorus that wouldn't stop burning, crush injuries from collapsed buildings, psychological trauma that had no name in her textbooks. The children are the worst, she wrote in her diary that night. They stare at nothing and flinch at every sound. They ask for their mothers, who will never come home. How do you treat a broken heart? How do you heal a shattered soul? The orphans were perhaps the most heartbreaking sight of all. Children wandering through the ruins, calling for parents who lay buried beneath tons of stone. Some were taken in by surviving relatives, others by neighbors who had lost their own families. But many simply disappeared into the chaos, becoming street children in a city that no longer had streets. Father Benedetto, one of 3 priests who had survived the bombing of Naples churches, established a makeshift orphanage in the basement of the Palazzo Reale. 12 children between the ages of 4 and 14, all of them alone in the world, all of them staring at him with questions he couldn't answer. Where is God? Asked 7-year-old Lucia, whose entire family had perished when the hospital was hit. If the Americans are the good people, why did they hurt us? The priest, who had devoted his life to providing answers, found himself speechless. How do you explain to a child that sometimes salvation looks like damnation? How do you justify the mathematics of modern warfare to someone who still believes in fairy tales and happy endings? As evening fell over the ruins of Naples, the Liberators began the process of establishing their administration. Military government officers set up headquarters in commandeer buildings, distributing pamphlets about democracy and freedom to people who were still digging bodies from the rubble. The pamphlets were printed in careful Italian, explaining that the bombing had been necessary to defeat fascism, that civilian casualties were regrettable but unavoidable, that the Italian people were now free to build a new future, that freedom felt like a cruel joke to people who had lost everything. Maria Benedetti found shelter that night in a refugee camp established in the Capo di Monte Park. 200 survivors crowded into tents meant for 50, sharing blankets and grief in equal measure. Antonio slept fitfully against her shoulder, whimpering in his dreams about angels that roared and stars that fell like fire. Around them, other families told their stories in whispers. The baker whose ovens had been buried under his shop, the teacher whose school had become a crater, the fisherman whose boat had been vaporized at the dock. Each story was a small universe of loss, a constellation of pain that together formed the true map of liberation. As Maria stared up at the real stars, visible now through the smoke that rose from her ruined city, she thought about the leaflets that had promised so much: democracy, freedom, bread. Instead, they had received fire from heaven and the bitter taste of ash. This was not the liberation they had prayed for. This was something else entirely, something that would haunt the dreams of survivors for generations to come. The price of freedom, it seemed, was measured in the tears of mothers and the silence of children who would never come home. Asterisk. The first thing they buried was the truth, even before the smoke had cleared over Naples, before the last bodies had been pulled from the ruins. The machinery of forgetting had begun to turn. In Allied headquarters in Algiers, staff officers were already crafting reports that would transform tragedy into necessity, civilian deaths into collateral damage, and the screams of children into the acceptable arithmetic of strategic warfare. Mission successful, read the official report filed by the 376th Bombardment Group. Primary targets destroyed with minimal opposition. Enemy supply capabilities significantly degraded. There was no mention of Maria Benedetti, who would never again sleep through the night without dreaming of falling angels. No reference to the children buried in the basement of Via dei Tribunali, their small hands still clutching the toys they would never outgrow. The mathematics of war had no room for such inconvenient details. Italy, after all, needed to look forward. In the months that followed the liberation of Naples, a curious amnesia began to settle over the official record. War correspondents who had witnessed the bombing were quietly reassigned to other theaters. Photographers whose cameras had captured the rows of small coffins found their film mysteriously damaged in development. Italian officials, dependent on Allied support for everything from food to political legitimacy, learned not to ask uncomfortable questions about the price of freedom. By 1945, when the war in Europe finally ended, a new narrative had crystallized. Italy had been saved from fascism by brave Allied forces who had fought with precision and humanity. The bombing campaigns were described as surgical strikes against military targets, conducted with all possible care to avoid civilian casualties. The official history of the Italian campaign, published by the U.S. Army in 1947, devoted exactly 2 paragraphs to civilian casualties from Allied bombing. 800 deaths in Naples became a footnote. The obliteration of entire neighborhoods was reduced to a statistical anomaly. The truth was edited out with bureaucratic efficiency. We must not dwell on the unfortunate incidents of the past, declared Luigi Einaudi, Italy's first post-war president, in a 1948 speech. Our future lies in partnership with our liberators, not in recriminations about the necessities of war, but for the survivors. Forgetting was not so simple. Carmela Esposito, who had lost all 4 of her children in the bombing, spent decades writing letters to newspapers, government officials, and historians. Her handwriting, shaky with age and grief, filled hundreds of pages with testimony that no one wanted to read. They say we should be grateful, she wrote to the Corriere della Sera in 1953. Grateful for what? For the privilege of burying our babies beneath stones dropped by our saviors? For the honor of losing everything we loved in the name of freedom? The letter was never published. Italian schools taught their students about the liberation with careful selectivity. Children learned about the fall of Mussolini, the German occupation, and the arrival of Allied forces who brought democracy and Marshall Plan aid. They did not learn about the nights when Italian cities burned under Allied bombs, or about the mothers who searched through rubble for children who would never be found. History textbooks from the 1950s contained maps showing the advance of Allied armies up the Italian peninsula, marked with neat arrows and battle dates. They did not contain photographs of the Quartieri Spagnoli after the bombing, or the statistics of civilian casualties that officials preferred to forget. Asterisk. We cannot build a new Italy on resentment, explained Professor Marco De Lacris, who chaired the commission responsible for writing post-war history curricula. Our children must learn about reconciliation, not revenge. But De Lacris's own father had died in the bombing of the Stazione Centrale, crushed beneath debris while trying to rescue strangers from a collapsed train car. The professor's commitment to reconciliation was built on foundations of personal grief that he was not allowed to acknowledge publicly. The psychological impact of this enforced forgetting was profound and lasting. Dr. Giuseppe Rinaldi, one of the few psychiatrists working in post-war Naples, noted a pattern among his patients that had no name in medical literature. Survivors of the bombing suffered from what he called liberation syndrome, a complex mixture of trauma, guilt, and rage that was impossible to treat because it could not be openly discussed. They cannot mourn properly, he wrote in his private notes. Society tells them they should be grateful for their freedom, but their hearts know only loss. They are trapped between official gratitude and personal grief, unable to process either emotion fully. His clinical observations were never published. Italian medical journals, dependent on government funding and American research partnerships, had no interest in studies that might complicate the narrative of successful liberation. Asterisk. Meanwhile, the architects of the bombing campaign were being celebrated as heroes. General Eisenhower received a ticker-tape parade in New York City. Air Marshal Tedder was knighted by King George VI. The bomber crews who had dropped death on Italian neighborhoods returned home to medals and commendations. Their service records carefully edited to emphasize their role in defeating fascism, while omitting any mention of civilian casualties. Captain James Morrison, the bombardier whose bombs had struck the hospital of Santa Maria degli Incurabili, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service in the Mediterranean theater. The citation praised his precision bombing of strategic targets that contributed significantly to Allied victory in Italy. Morrison himself knew better. In 1975, 30 years after the war, he traveled to Naples to see what had become of the city he had helped to destroy. Walking through the rebuilt Quartieri Spagnoli, now gleaming with post-war prosperity, he was approached by an elderly woman who recognized something familiar in his face. "You are American," she said in careful English. "Were you here during the war?" Morrison nodded, unable to speak. "My son died in the bombing," she continued quietly. "He was 8 years old. His name was Antonio. It was Maria Benedetti, now 73 years old, still carrying the weight of that terrible night." She looked at Morrison for a long moment, studying his face with eyes that had seen too much. "I have spent 30 years trying to hate you," she said finally, "but I cannot. You were young. You were told you were saving us. How could you know that salvation would feel like damnation?" Morrison wept openly in the street, surrounded by tourists and prosperity, carrying the burden of truth that official history had refused to acknowledge. He returned to America a changed man, spending his remaining years writing letters to newspapers and historians, trying to tell the story that no one wanted to hear. His memoir, The Weight of Heaven, was rejected by 17 publishers before being privately printed in a run of 500 copies. Most libraries refused to acquire it. The few historians who referenced it dismissed Morrison's account as the confused recollections of an aging veteran suffering from survivor's guilt. The pattern was repeated across Europe and America. Veterans who tried to speak honestly about civilian casualties were marginalized. Historians who questioned the necessity of strategic bombing found their funding cut and their careers derailed. The narrative of clean, surgical warfare was too valuable to the post-war order to allow inconvenient truths to intrude. By the 1960s, the sanitized version of history had become accepted fact. The liberation of Italy was taught as a model of precision warfare, a triumph of military efficiency and moral clarity. The Allied bombing campaigns were portrayed as necessary evils that had hastened the wars and saved countless lives by avoiding prolonged ground combat. Textbooks described the campaign in clinical language. Strategic bombing degraded enemy supply capabilities and facilitated rapid Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. They did not mention that degraded supply capabilities meant 8-year-old children buried alive in basements, or that facilitated rapid advance was written in the tears of mothers who had lost everything. The forgetting was so complete, so thorough, that by the 1970s, even the survivors began to doubt their own memories. Perhaps we were wrong to feel angry, Maria Benedetti wrote in her diary in 1973, 30 years after the bombing. Perhaps the Americans were right, and freedom required such sacrifice. Perhaps our grief is selfish, unpatriotic, but memory, like ash, as a way of rising unexpectedly, stirred by winds that authorities cannot control. In the archives and basements of Italy, forgotten documents waited to be discovered, photographs that had been hidden away, letters that had never been mailed, testimonies that had been ignored for decades. The truth, buried under 30 years of official forgetting, was still there, still waiting, still demanding to be heard. Asterisk. The first crack in the wall of silence came from an unexpected source. A dusty box in a Neapolitan basement. In 1989, 46 years after the bombing, renovation workers restoring a damaged church discovered a cache of documents hidden behind a false wall. Father Giuseppe, the priest who had died hearing confessions during the raid, had apparently spent his final weeks collecting testimonies from survivors. Determined that their stories would not be lost to history, the papers were water-stained and fragile, written in the careful hand of a man who knew he was preserving more than words. He was saving souls from oblivion. Today I spoke with Signora Benedetti. Read one entry. Dated November 20th, 1943. She told me her son has not spoken since the bombing. He draws pictures of angels with fire for wings. When I asked what the angels were doing, he said they were carrying his friends to heaven. I have no answer for such innocence. The discovery made headlines in the Italian press, but not in the way the survivors had hoped. Rather than sparking a national conversation about the forgotten costs of liberation, the documents were dismissed by mainstream historians as the traumatized recollections of people too close to events to judge them objectively. We must be careful not to let sentiment cloud our understanding of necessary wartime decisions, warned Professor Alessandro Vitali of the University of Rome. These testimonies, while touching, represent a subjective viewpoint that lacks the broader strategic context. But sentiment, once unleashed, proved difficult to contain. Maria Benedetti, now in her 70s, read about the discovery in her morning newspaper and felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of chains she had carried for nearly 5 decades. If Father Giuseppe had believed their stories were worth preserving, perhaps it was finally time to speak. She began writing letters, not to officials who had ignored her for decades, but to newspapers, television stations, anyone who might listen. Her handwriting was shakier now, but her memory remained crystalline, each detail preserved with the terrible clarity that trauma provides. I am 74 years old. She wrote to WWII television in 1990. I have spent most of my life trying to forget November 15th, 1943, but forgetting is a betrayal of the children who died. Someone must remember Antonio's laugh. Someone must remember how Signora Rossi made the best rack in the neighborhood. Someone must remember that we were people, not statistics. This time, someone listened. Juliana Scrina, a young investigative journalist with Il Manifesto, was assigned to follow up on what her editor assumed would be a brief human interest story about elderly survivors. Instead, she discovered a web of suppressed documentation that stretched across archives in Rome, London, and Washington. Allied bombing surveys, classified for decades, revealed the truth that official histories had obscured. Over 64,000 Italian civilians had died under Allied bombs, more than the combined death toll from German air raids on Britain during the entire Blitz. The numbers had been carefully excluded from post-war casualty reports, buried in bureaucratic language that transformed human beings into collateral damage estimates. The scale of it was staggering, Scrina later recalled. Here was one of the great untold stories of World War II, hidden in plain sight. Thousands of Italian families had lost everything to their supposed liberators, and history had simply erased them. Her investigation, published as a series in 1991, created ripples that became waves. Other journalists began digging through archives. Historians started asking uncomfortable questions. Most importantly, survivors began to speak, not the careful, grateful testimonies that officials had preferred, but raw, honest accounts of what liberation had actually felt like. Giuseppe Torino, now 78, had never spoken publicly about the night he lost his wife and 3 daughters in the bombing of Naples. But after reading Scrina's articles, he felt compelled to add his voice to the growing chorus. For 50 years, they told us to be grateful, he said in an interview with Corriere della Sera. Grateful for what? I buried my family with my own hands. I dug through rubble for 3 days looking for my children. When I found them, they were holding each other. My youngest daughter, Francesca, was still clutching her doll. His words, published on the front page, sparked something that authorities had feared for decades. A national conversation about the true cost of Italian liberation. Veterans groups, initially defensive, began to grapple with uncomfortable truths. Captain James Morrison, the American bombardier who had visited Naples in 1975, published his memoir with a major publisher. This time, editors didn't reject his account. They recognized it as part of a story that could no longer be suppressed. We were told we were liberating Italy, Morrison wrote. Instead, we learned that liberation could look exactly like destruction. The difference was only in the intentions of those dropping the bombs, not in the experience of those beneath them. Academic conferences that had once celebrated the precision of Allied strategic bombing now included panels on civilian casualties. Graduate students wrote dissertations on topics that had been taboo for decades. The comfortable narrative of clean, surgical warfare began to crumble under the weight of accumulated testimony. Dr. Elena Martinelli, the physician who had treated bombing victims in Naples, was interviewed extensively before her death in 1992. Her medical records from the war, preserved in hospital archives, provided clinical documentation of the human cost that official reports had minimized. White phosphorus burns are different from regular burns, she explained to a British television crew. They continue burning even underwater, eating through flesh and bone. I treated children whose bodies were consuming themselves from the inside out. That is not collateral damage. That is chemical warfare against innocence. The international response was mixed but significant. British historians began including civilian bombing casualties in their accounts of the Mediterranean campaign. American textbooks, while still emphasizing military necessity, at least acknowledged that precision bombing had been far less precise than wartime propaganda claimed. But perhaps the most powerful voices came from an unexpected source. The children who had survived. Antonio Benedetti, Maria's son, had spent 50 years refusing to discuss. November 15, 1943. The boy who had asked if they were going to die had become a man who couldn't sleep without medication, who flinched at sudden noises, who had never married because he couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else he loved. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing, he finally spoke. "I was 8 years old when the angels came," he said at a commemoration service in the rebuilt Quartiere Spagnoli. "That's what I called them, angels. They were silver and beautiful, and they flew in perfect formations across the sky. I waved at them from our window, believing they had come to save us." His voice broke, but he continued, "I learned that night that angels can carry death in their wings. That salvation can sound like thunder. That sometimes the people who say they love you are the ones who hurt you most." The service was filmed by news crews from across Europe. Antonio's words, broadcast to millions, carried the weight of all the voices that had been silenced for 50 years. In the audience, elderly survivors wept openly, not just for their losses, but for the relief of finally being heard. Their stories, dismissed for decades as unpatriotic or irrelevant, were finally being recognized as part of the larger human story of World War II. The truth, buried for half a century under layers of official forgetting, was finally rising from the ashes. Like smoke from ruins that time could not extinguish. Like memory that refused to die. Memory is the only justice the dead possess. Standing today in the Piazza del Plebiscito in Naples, surrounded by tourists and the comfortable noise of a modern European city, it's almost impossible to imagine that terrible November night in 1943. The scars have been healed with concrete and prosperity. The craters have been filled with cafes and shops. The silence of the dead has been replaced by the laughter of children who have never known war. But if you know where to look, if you listen carefully to the stories that old women still whisper in the shadows of ancient churches, you can still hear the echoes of that other Naples, the one that died beneath the bombs of its liberators. The mathematics of liberation tell one story. Strategic bombing shortened the war. Allied advance up the Italian peninsula was accelerated. German supply lines were disrupted. Military objectives were achieved with acceptable losses. But mathematics cannot quantify the weight of a mother's grief, or measure the value of a child's laugh that will never be heard again. Numbers cannot calculate the cost of dreams deferred, of futures that vanished in explosions of fire and stone. What is the strategic value of Signora Rossi's rack recipe, lost forever when she died in her courtyard? How do you measure the military importance of Father Giuseppe's gentle voice, silenced while he offered comfort to a frightened parishioner? What tactical advantage was gained by burying little Francesca Torino and her doll beneath the rubble of their home? These questions have no answers in the official histories. The liberation of Italy stands as one of World War II's great success stories, a masterpiece of Allied cooperation that demonstrated the superiority of democratic values over fascist ideology. The campaign is studied in military academies as a model of combined operations, praised by historians as a triumph of strategic planning and operational excellence. But triumph, like beauty, exists in the eye of the beholder. For Maria Benedetti, triumph looked like the moment she realized her son would never again sleep through the night without nightmares. For Giuseppe Torino, victory sounded like the silence that replaced his daughter's voices. For the children of Naples who survived that November night, freedom tasted like ash and carried the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. They had believed the leaflets that promised bread and democracy. They had trusted the voices on the radio that spoke of liberation and hope. They had opened their hearts to the possibility that suffering might finally end, that peace might finally come, that their children might grow up in a world without fear. Instead, they learned that liberation could wear the face of destruction, that saviors could rain fire from heaven, that the price of freedom was often paid by those who had never chosen war. The cruel irony was inescapable. Italy was being destroyed in order to be saved. Cities that had survived barbarian invasions, medieval plagues, and centuries of political turmoil were reduced to rubble in the name of democracy. Churches that had stood for 1,000 years crumbled under bombs dropped by young men who believed they were fighting for God and country. Children who had never heard of Hitler or Churchill died because their homes stood too close to railway stations that someone in a distant headquarters had marked as strategic targets. And When the smoke cleared, when the fires died, when the last stones stopped falling, the survivors were told they should be grateful. Grateful for their liberation. Grateful for their freedom. Grateful that their sacrifice had served the greater good. But gratitude is a luxury that the grieving cannot afford. The German army, which the bombing was meant to cripple, retreated in good order to prepare positions further north. Their supply lines, damaged but not broken, continued to function. Their resistance, far from being crushed, stiffened as they fell back to the Gothic line, where they would hold Allied forces for another year of bloody fighting. The strategic objectives of the bombing campaign: disrupting German logistics, hastening the end of the war, saving Allied lives, were only partially achieved. The tactical benefits were marginal at best, but the human cost was absolute and permanent. 8-year-old boys who learned that angels could carry death. Mothers who spent their remaining years searching for children who would never come home. Priests who died offering comfort to strangers while their own churches burned around them. Neighborhoods that disappeared so completely that even their names were forgotten. These were not acceptable losses. They were not collateral damage. They were not regrettable necessities. They were people. Human beings with names and stories and dreams that mattered every bit as much as the grand strategies that erased them from memory. Today, monuments across Italy celebrate the liberation. Marble soldiers stand frozen in heroic poses, commemorating battles and victories and the triumph of democratic ideals. Streets are named for Allied commanders and liberation dates. Museums display artifacts from the campaign with pride and reverence. But there are no monuments to Maria Benedetti's grief. No streets named for the children who died in basement shelters. No museums dedicated to the mothers who dug through rubble with their bare hands, searching for sons and daughters who had become statistics in someone else's victory. The official silence speaks louder than any monument ever could. It says that some deaths more than others, that some suffering is noble, while other suffering is merely unfortunate, that the children who died under German bombs were victims worthy of memory, while the children who died under Allied bombs were simply the price of progress. But memory, like smoke, has a way of drifting where it will, regardless of official boundaries. In the bars of Naples, old men still tell stories their grandfathers whispered. In the churches of Foggia, prayers are still offered for the dead who have no graves. In the quiet apartments of Rome, elderly women still flinch at the sound of aircraft passing overhead, still remember nights when salvation fell like fire from heaven. Their testimony, long dismissed and officially forgotten, carries a truth that no strategic analysis can contain. Liberation without justice is just another form of conquest. Freedom without memory is just another kind of slavery. Victory without acknowledgement of its human cost is just another variety of defeat. The people of Italy did not choose to become a battlefield. They did not ask to be liberated through destruction. They did not volunteer their children as acceptable losses in someone else's war. But they paid the price anyway, in blood and tears and decades of enforced silence. Their story, the story of civilians caught between armies, of innocents who died for strategies they never understood, of people who learned that liberation could look exactly like damnation, is part of World War II's legacy that we have been reluctant to acknowledge. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare, the meaning of victory, and the price we are willing to pay for ideals we claim to cherish. It reminds us that every bomb dropped, every building destroyed, every life lost in the name of freedom carries a human cost that cannot be calculated in strategic reports or celebrated in victory parades. And it challenges us to remember that behind every statistic lies a story. Behind every number lies a name. Behind every casualty report lies a universe of grief that deserves to be acknowledged, honored, and never forgotten. This is the debt we owe to the dead. To remember their stories, to speak their names, to ensure that their sacrifice is not erased by the comfortable amnesia of official history. They said they came to liberate us. Instead, They taught us that liberation is a word written in smoke, spelled out in ashes, and defined by those who survive to tell the tale. The angels came with silver wings and fire for hearts. And when they left, all that remained was memory, memory, and the terrible weight of freedom that costs too much and comes too late. For those who pay its price, fade to black over archival footage of children playing amid ruins. As the narrator's voice becomes a whisper, they said they came to liberate us, but they rained fire instead. Silence.